This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
We also welcome our returning celebrity guest and our first ever guest on the show. You know her from episodes like Inglourious Bastards, Zodiac, The Artist, My Fair Lady, and The Great Dictator. Please welcome Sarah Duncan.
Good to be back.
And what have you been doing for the last 3 years when you've been absent from the show?
I don't think it's actually been 3 years.
It's been 3 years. I looked it up. It was like June 16th, 2021.
Wow.
Well, I completed my master's degree in history and moved a state away.
Fair enough. It was to get away from us, right?
Oh, definitely. Especially you, Thomas. Dad,
yes.
I miss.
Well, Dad is the mascot of the show, and everybody seemingly likes him a lot more than me. I'm an acquired taste, like port wine.
I do appreciate a good port, though.
Brussels sprouts?
I like, especially charred Brussels sprouts.
Yes, with a
With
little
pepper.
bit of hot honey and bacon. Ooh.
Mm.
Tom is always best with complimentary other things, like alcohol.
You mean that you consume, not me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not quite as good with my alcohol.
No, you are a morose...
Introspective drunk.
Yeah, you're not fun.
Yes.
I get, great moments of clarity, but it annoys everyone around me.
Your idea of clarity, and most of us think it's through rose-colored glasses, but okay.
It's about the same way I feel post-coital.
That's too much information.
I wouldn't want to know that, so that's good. Let's just move on.
We're starting off well already, aren't we? Okay. We also welcome our newest celebrity guest, an Instagram and Letterboxd film commentator reviewer. Please welcome Joe Boukhari.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me on. Excited to be here. Excited to be part of this banter and awkward opening conversation. It's always a good time.
Yeah, I'm sure. We hadn't even brought you in and you're already experiencing the full Duncanness.
There we go.
All right. And Joe, as you're well aware, with new guests to the show, we ask you a few questions just for the audience to get to know you. So first up, tell us a little about yourself, what you do, and why you love movies.
Well, I am a trainer in learning and development for a retail company by day. And I don't really like the term by night, but I suppose by weekend and other free time. I'm also a real estate agent in the DFW area. So, this gig economy has us all working 2 jobs out here. So kind of normal, I guess, for most people. But I love movies because they are, they're just a way to learn about different types of people or different situations or topics, things that you wouldn't always be exposed to in everyday life from your friend or family circle. For my page on Instagram, I always try to do a different theme each month. Sometimes it's hard to pull a theme, but it's nice. Like right now it's Pride Month, so I'm watching a lot more Pride movies than I usually would. And it's really great to get to see, just life from different aspects. I haven't seen a lot of bad movies, but I think since deciding to embark into 500 movies a year, I've seen a lot more bad movies, I suppose. But I just enjoy jumping in and getting a chance to see different stories and learn new things about people. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, sometimes it's good, sometimes you cry, sometimes you laugh, and I love all the in-betweens as well.
So that leads us to our second question. What is your favorite movie and why?
So it's ever changing. which I know is probably just the cinephiles, cross to bear, so to speak.
Par for the course.
Yeah, so recently I really, really love Thelma and Louise, but I think just a step above that. I love nearly anything from Spike Lee. Malcolm X is probably my favorite movie. It is an epic journey from start to finish, but the most recent time I watched it, I could not get over the chemistry between Denzel and Angela Bassett as Betty and Malcolm, and just kind of that journey of he's got so many other things going on, but you can see those intimate moments. And then, of course, the iconic double dolly shot of Malcolm heading to his ultimate end, I suppose, and Sam Cooke playing, like, that's probably all-time most powerful scene. Like, just hearing that Sam Cooke string moment of that song will nearly bring me to tears, just maybe because of that scene, but also just, I mean, the song's amazing too. So yeah, right now it's Malcolm X, but yeah, it'll ebb and flow probably here and there as I watch different stuff.
So Malcolm X over Do the Right Thing?
I think so, and maybe I'm a little more period piece, even though I guess now Do the Right Thing could be considered period, but I think Malcolm X over Do the Right Thing, but yeah, I ugly cried at the end of Do the Right Thing the last time I watched it, so still very powerful nonetheless. Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely powerful. All right, last question. What makes a good movie for you?
I think it's just got to make you feel something. If whether it's emotional, if it's a good cry, a good laugh, a good like, oh my goodness, I can't believe they did that. Whatever the movie is, if it makes you feel something, I think that goes. I think that's what makes it good. If you can't get engulfed in it to feel something when you're watching it, then it's not engaging. I know everybody does two screen, and I'm guilty of being on my phone while I watch a movie that I'm not engaged in. But I think it's got to make you feel something. And recently, we've had a ton of fun. So I've got an 8-year-old daughter, and me and her and my wife, we watched both Parent Trap movies over the weekend. And my 8-year-old just sits and just rips the movie apart. From like the absurd plot premise, and these people are picking a twin and just sticking with one, and they don't want the other one, and it's just the absurdity of movies. And that's what also has made a good movie, is getting to see my kid come into her little movie critic. So I'll ask her score of the movie, and most kids geared movies are always a 5 out of 5 for her, of course, but it's just nice seeing her think about it and process. And then my new favorite thing, like super proud dad moment, is she is noticing like scene transitions and good editing. And I do some of that for my work. I make videos and whatnot, so I look at stuff differently. And now she'll be like, "Oh, that was a good transition," and I'm like, "Oh, I just love what we've created with our tiny cinephile child." So it's a lot of fun.
Dad, I don't think I've ever asked you, did you have a proud dad moment as the only resident other parent on the episode?
Boy, I'm trying to think. I think with you, when you really got into Rio Bravo, and then referred to your grandpa as an old guy like Stumpy.
That was like at 4?
Probably about 3. Because it was right before
pretty young.
We moved.
Well, I will admit that, unfortunately, I've seen the Lindsay Lohan Parent Trap way too many times for my own personal liking. It's an okay film, but not to have watched the 47 times I think I did in my younger youth due to a sibling of mine who is not on the show this evening. Oh, well, we digress. So, yes. That leads us into our evening. Tonight, for our 217th episode, we discuss the Best Picture winner of 1994 with Forrest Gump, celebrating its 30th anniversary this week. Directed by Robert Zemeckis, written by Eric Roth, music by Alan Silvestri, starring Tom Hanks as the titular Forrest Gump, Michael Connor Humphreys as young Forrest Gump, Robin Wright as Jenny Curran, Hannah R. Hall as young Jenny Curran, Gary Sinise as Lieutenant Dan Taylor. I'm going to butcher this, but McKelty Williamson as Benjamin Buford Bubba Blue. Say that 5 times fast. Sally Field as Mrs. Gump, Haley Joel Osment as Forrest Gump Jr., Peter Dobson as Elvis Presley, Dick Cavett as himself, Sam Anderson as Principal Hancock, Jeffrey Blake as Wesley, Siobhan Fallon Hogan as Dorothy Harris, Sonny Schroeder as Coach Paul Bear Bryant, Grand L. Bush, Michael Jace, Connor Kennelly, and Teddy Lane Jr. as the Black Panthers, Richard D'Alessandro as Abby Hoffman, and Tiffany Salerno and Marla Sucarezza as Cunning Carla and Long Limbs Lenore. Recognition for this movie? Forrest Gump premiered on June 23, 1994. Based on the novel of the same name by Winston Groom, the film would go on to gross $329 million, making it the number 2 film of 1994. Did anybody happen to look up what was number 1?
Raiders.
That was 1981, Dad.
Was it, am I getting my years right? Was it Jurassic Park?
That was the year before. All right, do you need a hint?
Before I was born, so...
Okay. You're a historian. Everything's before you're born.
Lion King, yes.
Lion King.
Lion King. Yep.
Good singing.
Well, thank you. The $329 million gross also made Forrest Gump surpass Raiders of the Lost Ark for total box office, making it placed 4th all-time during its release. Jurassic Park was one of the other ones that was ahead of it, obviously The Lion King. Can you name the other movie that would have been ahead of it at this time? It's another one we've covered on the show.
Star Wars.
Nope. If it were adjusted for inflation, Star Wars and Gone with the Wind would be ahead of it, yes, but not in actual receipts. E.T. Phone Home.
I see.
Yes, that was number 1 until Jurassic Park surpassed it, and Lion King surpassed this film. All right. Forrest Gump would receive widespread critical acclaim and would go on to be nominated for 12 Academy Awards, including Best Supporting Actor for Gary Sinise, Original Score for Alan Silvestri, Sound Effects Editing, Sound, Art Direction, Cinematography, and Makeup. It would win Best Picture, Director for Robert Zemeckis, Actor for Tom Hanks, Adapted Screenplay for Eric Roth, Costume Design, Film Editing, and Visual Effects. In the years since, Forrest Gump has become a lightning rod for reanalysis by online film fans and critics alike, many of which feel it is the inferior film to 2 other all-time classics previously discussed on this show, and which will be revisited this September, The Shawshank Redemption and Pulp Fiction. In 2015, The Hollywood Reporter polled hundreds of Academy members, asking them to re-vote on past controversial decisions. Academy members said that, given a second chance, they would award the 1994 Oscar for Best Picture to The Shawshank Redemption instead. In spite of this, it has been recognized by the AFI on the following lists. AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies at number 71, AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movie Quotes at number 40 with Mama always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get. AFI's 100 Years, 100 Cheers at number 37. AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies 10th Anniversary Edition at number 76. And the film also ranked at number 61 on Empire's list of the 100 greatest movies of all time. In 2011, Forrest Gump was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry of the United States. Forrest Gump currently holds a 76% on Rotten Tomatoes, an 82% on Metacritic, and a 4.1 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So as we start each week, Dad, what is your relationship to this film?
I took your mother to it on a date night. So,
and what happened? Well, during the movie,
the...
not after. I don't need to know the after.
Well, I don't remember what happened after, but anyway.
Not that good, huh?
We're watching the movie. I shouldn't have
invited that.
Yeah. We're watching the movie, and what ended up about, at one point in the scene where Gary Sinise is thanking Forrest for saving his life, and then he jumps into the water
Well,
into the
he
ocean.
never really thanked him. He said, "I never thanked you." He never said, "Thank you." Semantics.
Anyway, your mother turns to me and says, "Where in the world did they find such a good actor without legs?" I lost it. She's getting madder and madder the harder I'm laughing. And I just said, it's all done with the computer or graphics. Oh. So he has legs? Yes, he does.
I think there's actually a good episode of the movies that made us on Netflix about Forrest Gump and how they did all the CGI and green screen effects, but this is about the first times that they were actually doing those things. So I can't be too mad at my mother for getting that wrong. But it is funny. It has lived in family lore for 30 years.
I know. I love my wife dearly, and she's a very bright, intelligent woman, but every once in a while she just has a brain fart.
Sarah, what's your relationship to the film, or can you even remember?
I'm pretty sure we first watched it as a family. I'm not exactly certain as to the first time I watched this movie, but I've seen it multiple times through the years. I think... Did we rewatch this in 2020 when we were hauled up together?
It's possible. We watched so many movies that year when there was nothing else to do that it's hard to keep track of all the ones that I watched with you. There are certain ones I definitely remember showing you for the first time, but I don't remember specifically whether we watched this one or not. I mean, it's very possible.
I think we did, and then I've just really actually enjoyed, even at work this week, I've talked about the fact that I was coming to talk about this film, and like everybody that I talked to about the fact I had this going on with this particular film had something to say about this movie. I mean, it's been kind of an interesting point, because it actually, I didn't actually know that I had so many movie fans around me. So, yeah, I mean, it's been one of those movies that I have enjoyed for over a decade. But it's not one that I've commonly seen.
I would say I'm in a similar boat. I don't really remember the first time that I saw it. It's just one of those movies that's been so culturally popular and that it's been relevant for so long that you just knew what this was. You probably knew the lines before you probably even saw the film. For me, I mean, life is like a box of chocolates, or my dad quoting, nobody ever got into trouble by keeping their mouth shut, as a lawyer, of course. Those are things that just stuck with me all through childhood and whatever else. This movie was such a cultural phenomenon that maybe this is a hot take, but I think the notion that this shouldn't have won Best Picture because it wasn't the best film is kind of absurd. When we were in that era, this is when constantly the number one movie of the year, or a movie in the top 5 that everybody saw that was even of somewhat decent quality and wasn't a franchise type film. Like Jurassic Park was not winning Best Picture, but a lot of people saw Saving Private Ryan and Schindler's List and Braveheart, Apollo 13.
Titanic.
Like, exactly. These were huge movies at the time. And to have this notion that even though Pulp Fiction finished number 10 at the box office that year and was this indie darling, that it was somehow going to usurp this juggernaut of Forrest Gump at the time is incorrect. And I'll also say, maybe to preempt a further question later on, but the point of the Oscars is not to get it right, but it's actually to get stuff wrong. It makes movies more interesting when they get stuff wrong, so we can look back and say, oh, Citizen Kane should have won. So we have these discussions and long-ranging things, and people are introduced to Citizen Kane for the first time 60, 70, 80 years later. So the notion of the Oscars getting it right is completely absurd for me. But Joe, what was your first experience with this?
I was I had to Google earlier to see if this was one of those movies that was the double VHS back in the 90s, but it was not. The aforementioned Malcolm X was the double, I think, at the time. But we definitely rented this movie at our local video store in the tiny town I grew up outside of. and watched it as a family, and I'm sure watched it repeatedly for those like 3 days before we had to rewind it and return it. I remember us going to the mall to go to the music store to get the soundtrack, because the soundtrack is just back to back banger after banger, and being in awe at 8-9 years old, going, oh, I would have been 9 when this came out, going, wait, they make double CDs? You can put 2 CDs in one package? And like my brain being blown that this was a soundtrack for a movie that was longer than the movie when you play the songs, front to back. And that's, the soundtrack is probably one I have a bigger relationship with than the movie itself. But I did always enjoy the movie. And I think as I've aged and maybe taken on different mindsets about things or different perspectives on things, or just grown, I suppose, my relationship maybe has waned a tad with the movie. But I still, I recall doing and we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, flipping the channel and it's on and it's staying on until it's over kind of thing. So, I did have a lot of great, relationship with it, memories, and those rentals and the soundtrack. Just the double disc, it looked so big at the time for that, double CD packaging. So that, honestly, that's like my photographic memory moment with this movie, is the soundtrack.
Yes, kids, pull up a seat and let us tell you about the era of VHS, CDs, Blockbuster, and returning.
Yeah.
Be Kind, Rewind.
All of the things. Yes, I know. I just hit all of my approaching 40 check marks here for the 90s nostalgia.
Yeah, if somebody wants to create a drinking game based on 90s movies we cover, I think, you probably hit this pretty early on. So shots.
There we go, yes.
All right. So then what is this movie actually about? I actually found it was about a lot of things, if I really thought about it. But what do you guys think?
Well, I'm happy to go with potentially the hottest take.
Ooh.
And I think that this is a capitalist's wet dream, that if you just do exactly what you're told and you serve your country and you steal an idea from your buddy that you were in the military with, that you too will become a millionaire. It is insane.
To be honest, you are not very far off from the National Review, which named this as one of the top 25 conservative films of all time.
Yeah.
All right, so we had one hot take already. Somebody got something else spicy?
Mine's not necessarily spicy, but it is kind of, well, I don't know if anybody else caught it, but I want to bring up the feather from the beginning and the end of the film, in which he presses in the book. It's in the photo of the movie when you go and actually look it up online. It's something that comes up time and again, and I think the best quote that's associated with it is this idea of destiny, of he doesn't necessarily believe if everybody has a destiny like his mom does, or if we have choice in the matter. And I think it's a lot to do with how a lot of his life was an accident, and how he just happened upon these things because he was, by and large, himself. So I think it is a lot about him being himself and about what we're all supposed to and meant to do with our lives.
And to make this a pure Rorschach test, I'm going to go the other direction, which is you can be a person with little advantages in life, intelligence, physical abilities, etc. But by relying on people and listening to them and acting on your gut feelings at times, they can help you or propel you into a successful, great life. Because we have Jenny on the bus, we have her telling him to run. He stumbles into the university and does, they put him in a position to be successful, and he follows along. He takes up ping pong. He gets into the army and he makes a buddy, and the buddy is the one who gives him all of the guidance and ideas and structure. I will say that this film is just as much a socialist film as it is a capitalist film.
All right. So we have one capitalist, one socialist, one fate and destiny, I guess, existentialist. So we're getting heavy into the philosophy. I will say I'm a little bit colored by my profession in watching this movie. I was struck thinking about it, how much everybody in the film, at least all the primary characters, seem to be dealing with a disability. So obviously Forrest is like right out front and center, but Lieutenant Dan's is the most easily recognizable with his physical disability. But Jenny's dealing with a certain level of PTSD and childhood trauma. And so everybody's working through it collectively towards a better good, a better future. So you could say that certain acts of kindness, value in people's stories, is to me what the movie, like, really why it connected with people. We start the movie by this woman sitting on the bench next to him, not being interested in his story at all. And you're like, he's just trying to be nice. He's trying to give you a chocolate. And she's, of course, just trying to like get through her day, her feet hurt, etc. But this guy's just trying to be nice to you. And by the end of the film, we have people who literally are like invested in his story. So the random acts of kindness throughout this movie, whether it's Forrest running back into Vietnam to collect all of his buddies, whether it's Jenny allowing him to sit on the bus next to him, or Bubba, any of these little things, or Lieutenant Dan remembering on his own that he said he would be his first mate, and then coming down of his own volition with his wheelchair to Louisiana to be his first mate. And then investing in Apple for him. There's some fruit company.
Yeah.
I think this movie is littered with acts of kindness and people that would be otherwise marginalized. And I think that's maybe one of the things that is uplifting about the film.
There is a big sense of stay true. And Sarah, I liked kind of what you were saying, stay true to yourself. And things will happen. At no point did he try to conform to Jenny being a hippie, or conform to the Black Panther Party that he was in, or go all Semper Fi, I've got to die for my country like Lieutenant Dan. He just stayed tried and true and followed all the stuff that his mom told him, and just like you all were saying, what he was gleaning from everyone else. So there is something admirable about that, of being able to stay true to yourself, even if it's not common. And I like the note about people can see themselves in this movie, whether it's through different family members or disabilities or addiction, or just going about life with a smile on your face like Forrest did. So, while I've got some hard opinions, I don't hate this movie. Let me get that out of the way early before we go too far.
I think you would get a lot more mileage out of actually being hateful of the film than the other way around. I mean, obviously with the way the discourse has gone lately, but there was a reason at one time this film connected with America. And I've given you my theory of the case, but what do you guys think about why this movie became such a cultural touchstone, at least domestically?
I think by and large, it's because this touched on so many things that the average person deals with. So everybody can see a part of their life reflected in it, and has a different piece of it that speaks to them, whether it's dealing with addiction, dealing with childhood trauma, dealing with military experiences, having somebody in your life that has been, or that is disabled and suffering from those problems, whether by the military or outside of that. Everybody in their life has something that they can see of themselves in this.
Well, let me introduce or put forward the idea that the criticism has often been this is melodramatic and it's oversimple, that a lot of these ideas are not grand enough or whatever else. And you're actually saying that the simplism of the idea is actually what makes this relatable. So would you fight back against that criticism that it's been levied in the last, 20 years now?
Yes, because I don't think that by and large the average person needs something to connect with that is this dramatic idea. we can all sit through and enjoy and experience a wonderful film that touches on something that we personally have experienced. Like, I think the beauty of this is that because it's boiled down, because it's simple and it's fun, people just have joy when they see this movie.
I think people are a little over criticizing this film simply as being melodramatic and pop art, all that. Okay, when I use the term Rorschach test, I wasn't being just trying to be funny per se. I mean, it is. And that the simplicity of this. I think people read different things out of this because of its simplicity. I mean, what's the ultimate in simplicity? Have you seen any of the later works of Pablo Picasso? It's lines and circles on a canvas. Okay? And yet people can go and write dissertations on Pablo Picasso's later works because they're open to interpretation. That's the nature of art. The better the art is, the more different people look at it and see something different. The idea is to stir your imagination, to stir your subconscious. And sometimes, because it is your subconscious, to bring some thoughts or feelings up from there that you don't normally think about. And that's ultimately what makes this film successful, because I think if you ask these questions to 100 people, you're likely to get about 80 to 85 different answers.
Yeah. And I think, and back to the why America loves Forrest Gump as a movie, it is that true underdog story. And this is one of the earliest movies I can think of that is the perfect Rick Dalton pointing at the screen, oh my goodness, that's where that's from, meme, because there is so much pop culture baked into this. Granted, a lot of it is who else got assassinated or had an attempted assassination, but there are so many little pieces, and Zemeckis had a field day with putting things into this movie, including a picture of the president and Marilyn Monroe when Forrest goes to use the bathroom. Like, he just was Easter eggs galore, but it was stuff that people knew about. You get into Watergate and you get into the Beatles and you get into all of this pop culture stuff that is fun to watch and is fun to see and is fun to know that you get the inside joke that the director put in there, as opposed to it being an obscure, oh, I was, inspired. And I love movies that are inspired by, movies that 5 people have seen. I love that kind of stuff too. But this is stuff where I think people could look at it and go, yep, I got that reference. And they could talk about it the next day or the next week. And it made it easier to connect with the art, especially when a director can say, I want this and this and this in here, and nobody's ever going to see it because it's, a fraction of a frame. But I think that's what made it a lot of fun. And then, of course, I think on the side of it, yeah, it can be simple and yes, it's poppy, and it is a symbol of pop culture, really, from the 60s, from Elvis staying at his mom's house to all the way into all of the stuff that he saw when he was running and inspiring bumper stickers and smiley face t-shirts. But it got to a point where it's cute and then it wears and then it comes back and you love it, is kind of the journey I took on this most recent watch, where I was like, oh, I'm so sick of the references here. But then it almost beat me into submission, where I was like, no, give me more. I want more references here. Let them all come, aside from them nearly kicking off the movie with Forrest's namesake being from, the founder of a certain clan that wore sheets on their head. That's the only one I could maybe do without. But overall, I think this does cover a lot of bases. And I think to be palatable for everyone, it does have to take some broad generalizations with hippies or Black Panthers or servicemen or just simple Southern folk too. And that's what made it so maybe more accessible for everyone versus just as, somebody looking for all those pieces.
I do think that I'm aware that there's a longer extended cut, like a director's cut of this movie. But even at the 2 hour and I think it's like 15-minute run that this is, you do feel some of its length.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that there are moments in this where it really does ebb and flow. It starts out well and you get really kind of gestating and running, metaphorically, of course. And you can kind of get into the movie, and then kind of like around ping pong, it just kind of dips a little bit. And when Jenny's out of the picture, it doesn't have the pizzazz until you kind of get around the shrimping boat. And then about that point, it's like, all right, we're back in a little bit. And then it kind of dips again when he's going to run cross country. And then about the time where he meets his son, you're like, oh yes, let's end on a great note.
Mm-hmm.
So I can understand that this is not necessarily everybody's movie. And the more you watch film, the harder it is to watch something that's sometimes so simple that you don't want to allow yourself to just be emotionally connected to something. This is a movie that has broad appeal. And so just because it's not the favorite of film fan critics on the internet doesn't mean it's not a good film.
And quite frankly, as far as the length, I'd forgotten that it's almost like they wanted to draw the film to an end. And they go, oh shit, we came up with all these scenes of him running. So we have to stick those on at the end. Because they just didn't seem to fit. I mean, quite frankly, when I'm looking at the film, they could have cut that whole segment out and it would have made the film much tighter and I think more interesting.
Probably, but then I don't think the timeline works precisely. But then again, I have a remaining question later on that will address when does this movie actually take place? Because I think instead of being contemporary, I always grew up, every time I watched this film, I thought it was happening in 1994. I think there's an argument to be made that this is happening in like 1985.
Could be. And he did run
That would be my guess.
He did run for whatever it was, 3 years, and he had down to the
2 months, 14 days, and 16 hours.
There we go. Your notes came in handy, Sarah. Yes, so and that was nearly it worked perfectly for the age of Haley Joel Osment's Forrest Gump Jr.
Yeah, almost exactly.
Yes.
So I think, and even we don't know the indeterminate amount of time that Jenny was staying at the house. Like, it seems like she was there for more than a week or a weekend, but we don't know exactly how long that was. And we were still like in the 70s when he gets the shrimping thing together.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think there is some time. And then after he meets Forrest Jr.,
I was just going to say, we could try to date it based on the hurricane.
Well, I suppose, but that only takes you to so far. And we do get a flash forward, 1973, when they have the New Year's party? That's quite clearly shown.
And they have the Watergate break-in.
That's true. That's 72? 71?
72. It was like April of 72.
Yeah, okay. And then they flash forward to Nixon's resignation pretty quickly. So there is like some time jumping quite clearly throughout the movie. But when the movie begins, I want to say it's in the 50s because everybody would have known Elvis after like 1953. So for him to show up in a boarding house, you would think that most people would know who he was. He's not just palling around in some random boarding house.
Elvis, really, his popularity started about 56, 57.
Okay,
where
so
he
a little bit
really
later
well
than
known.
that. I thought for sure, though, that like Jailhouse Rock had come out before that, but I guess I'm wrong. Anyway,
try to back into when magic legs were invented for Lieutenant Dan, so that's another way we could try to get the time frame on.
Fair enough. So, Dad, are you ready to give us a little bit more background on this movie? Do you have a plot summary ready for us?
I do. In Robert Zemeckis' Forrest Gump, we follow the extraordinary journey of a seemingly ordinary man through decades of American history. Tom Hanks delivers a career-defining performance as Forrest, a man with pure heart and limited IQ whose life intertwines with pivotal moments from the 1950s to the 1980s. The film is a nostalgic reflection on the turbulent events that shape a nation viewed through Forrest's innocent eyes. From his childhood leg braces to becoming a college football star, Forrest's life unfolds in unexpected ways. Guided by his unwavering optimism and his accidental knack for being in the right place at the right time. At its core, Forrest Gump is a tale of resilience and the enduring power of love and friendship. Supported by a stellar cast including Robin Wright and Gary Sinise, Zemeckis weaves together a narrative that celebrates the triumph of the human spirit amidst chaos and uncertainty. With its iconic quotes, memorable soundtrack, and poignant storytelling, Forrest Gump stands as a testament to the enduring charm of cinema that captures the essence of American life with humor, heart, and a touch of magic.
Thank you. Did you know? When Forrest gets up to talk at the Vietnam rally in Washington, the microphone plug is pulled and you cannot hear him. According to Tom Hanks, Forrest said, quote, "Sometimes when people go to Vietnam, they come home to their mamas without any legs. Sometimes they don't go home at all. That's a bad thing. That's all I have to say about that." Did you know? Prior to filming, Paramount Pictures had cut the original budget by about $10 million, and were trying to force director Robert Zemeckis to cut out scenes they felt were unnecessary, like the shrimp boat or the Vietnam scenes. Zemeckis fought the studio hard to keep those scenes, and Paramount executive Michelle Manning was even sent to the set to supervise filming and make sure the movie stayed within budget. Zemeckis eventually gave up part of his and Tom Hanks' salary to keep most of the scenes, and eventually agreed to cut out Forrest's running sequence. However, Zemeckis then simply ignored the studio's wishes, even receiving support from Manning. The running scenes were shot in secrecy without the studio's knowledge, and Tom Hanks' younger brother, Jim Hanks, doubled for him in many of them. According to Jim, Tom had other doubles, but they couldn't do the run, which was a reference to Forrest's geeky, stiff stride. That's, quote, a stupid Tom Hanks thing. The studio eventually found out, but when they saw the raw footage, they relented. Only the scene at Monument Valley was still missing because the money had run out, and since the studio refused to pay for it, Hanks and Zemeckis did it themselves. When the studio imposed these budget cuts, both director Robert Zemeckis and star Tom Hanks waived a large part of their fee in exchange for percentage points, which ultimately netted Hanks in the region of $40 million.
Always take the residuals.
Yeah, take the points.
Did you know? When Forrest first learns to play ping pong in the infirmary, he is told the trick is to keep his eye on the ball at all times by another soldier. After that moment, if you ever see him on screen, whenever he is shown playing ping pong, he never blinks. Did you know? Tom Hanks signed on to this film after an hour and a half of reading the script, but agreed to take the role only on the condition that the film was historically accurate. He initially wanted to ease Forrest's pronounced Southern accent, but was eventually persuaded by Robert Zemeckis to portray the heavy accent stressed in the novel, and he patterned his accent after Michael Connor Humphreys, who played young Forrest, who actually spoke that way. The crew and especially studio head Sherry Lansing initially had serious doubts about Hanks' goofy accent, but Zemeckis stuck to his guns. Did you know? During the ambush in Vietnam, the enemy is never actually seen. This led many combat veterans, especially Vietnam veterans, to rate this as one of the most accurate combat scenes in movie history. It was very sudden, the enemy isn't seen, and it happens very quickly. And with that, we will take our first break, and we will be right back. Oh, shit. Before we jump back into the episode, next week for our 218th episode, we welcome back returning guest Kieran B. of the Best Picture Cast to the show, and new guest Sarah Shea of the Shea Cinema Podcast to revisit one of my personal favorite films of all time, 12 Angry Men from 1957, directed by Sidney Lumet, written by Reginald Rose, music by Kenyon Hopkins, starring Henry Fonda, Lee J. Cobb, Ed Begley, E.G. Marshall, and Jack Warden. You won't want to miss that one, so watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. So, before we move on, Sarah, is there any place that you would be available for, let's say, people to find you if they like this episode? I don't think we've ever thrown out any of your socials, or do you want to remain private?
Actually, I'm cool with that. As somebody who regularly posts about like historical stuff that I'm working on, or different archaeological sites that I'm visiting, kind of love that. My Instagram name is @the_nomadic_archaeologist.
All right, and you have anything else to promote before we move on?
Not at this current time. I am hopefully in the next couple of months working on getting a paper published, and then I will, of course, come back on and talk about that for any of you history fans.
Who are you working on with?
Well, that's a different paper that we're working on together, Dan.
Oh, okay.
I was unaware of this.
Oddly enough, the paper that I am working on is the glorification of war in Hollywood cinema.
So, and for anybody that's out there, you will next be on the show the first week of November for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. We also have a new guest for the show joining for that episode as well. Which leads me back. Joe, what do you got going on and where can people find you?
Well, I'm on Instagram. That's probably the easiest place to see my editing and posting prowess, I suppose. I get to it when I get to it. The theme of that and my Letterboxd is really, as a dad and somebody with hobbies and 2 jobs and all that, I gotta get to things when I can get to them. So it's hard to get to the movies, or it's hard to jump on things the second they come out. And that's kind of the theory. So there are still quite a few movies that may offend some people that I have not gotten to yet, including aforementioned 12 Angry Men, or even the entire Godfather trilogy. So there are movies that just are in my blind spot, and that's kind of the theme of my Instagram page. You can also find me on Letterboxd. It's just Bag of Donuts, which I believe was for Mickey Blue Eyes, for a Joey Bag of Donuts mob name. That's just a nickname that stuck from years back. And I think that's it. That's where you can find me for all things movies. Instagram, I'll post most of my reviews. And then I'll do like a weekend wrap up, so people don't have to endure me reviewing what my kid wanted to watch over the weekend. So if you want those reviews, those are on Letterboxd. Everything else is on Instagram. But I have a lot of fun and try to post random thoughts on reels and stuff like that. So very, very cool community, and I've had a ton of fun getting it started beginning of last year. So it's growing, and I've had a ton of fun with it. So give me a follow over there. Get to it when I get to it.
Awesome. And we will have the links for both of our guests and what they've mentioned, both in our episode description and on the website, if you want to have easier access to find them. I will say, at least for me, the inclination, anytime you mention one of those big movies and you haven't seen it, it's automatically, oh, you haven't seen that? And I have to control myself. I try to resist the urge as much as humanly possible, not to film shame. I know it's really common amongst us film bros, but I want to congratulate you that you still have yet to see them, because that means you can still see them for the first time.
Yes.
And I cannot.
Yeah. And actually next month, so July is not a properly themed month, albeit any type of history month or anything of that nature. So July, my theme is going to be movies from before I was born. So that's going to include, I mean, obviously there's a whole, whatever that is, 85 years just in the 1900s alone that are prior to me being born. But that's kind of the goal, is to hit some of these older ones and the classics that, of course, can gain stigma when you're not, when you just want to see shiny new things all the time. So I'm excited to dig into some stuff. I've got things queued up all on all my streamers. So I'm happy to, and send me recommendations. I'm happy to take any inbox DMs for recommendations for old movies as well.
You hear that, Film Twitter? He needs recommendations. All right. So, before we move on, this is normally our new Ask Dana Anything segment. I really should have like a soundbite or something with that, like game show. Ask Dana Anything, or something like that. But I haven't taken the time to try and do that yet. Regardless, we have not received any from our outside audience, so I will ask our guests, do you have any questions for our mascot and co-host?
I'm good on my side, but maybe a recommendation for your intro will just be a good Dana okay as the intro sound for the Ask Dana Anything segment.
Okay. we might be able to do that. Get a Dana okay as a ringtone. I know I've had at least one guest mention they wanted to get my Did You Know as a ringtone.
Okay.
Well, I actually do have an Ask Dana Anything. As a fellow alumnus and a curious person of what the college was actually like prior to me being there, as they've had a numerous amount of very weird and interesting things at the campus, from everything from a softcore porn film being filmed on campus to a murder. What is your favorite and potentially your funniest memory from college?
So we're referring to our joint our alma mater, which is Beloit College in Beloit, Wisconsin, which is where I grew up. And I'm about a handful. Literally, I think there's only 12 or 13 people that graduated from Beloit Memorial High School and Beloit College. I think that's what the Alumni Association told me. So I'm a rare breed. But my funniest moment was I was working as part of one of my summer or my college age jobs was I worked in the security office. And I was the dispatcher. And so during the year, they actually had a switchboard, an old switchboard, where a call would come in and they would ask for whoever, and they had a list of where everybody was in the dorms. And then you would transfer it to a particular extension that would ring on the floor nearest their dorm room. Okay? And then the other thing that you did is about every 10 to 15 minutes, the security guards would call in. Okay? And you had to write down what they had, where they were, what they were doing, what they inspected, and any incidents, like they broke up a fight or there were people from outside the campus that were on the grounds or whatever. Well, the one night in my dorm, okay, we had 3 brothers who were Palestinian. And I know they were Palestinians because they all had big photo posters of Arafat on their walls. Well, we had this huge rainstorm. And it's in the area right by the college as you're walking towards the dorms up from Morris Ingersoll on Emerson. Okay. The sewers were all plugged up. We had, and I'm not exaggerating, I think something like 4 inches of rain in an hour and a half. One of the security guards came back and he is drenched from about mid-chest down. He had to wade through that high of water in that area on the road. Well, I got off at 11 and I went back, and the Hassan brothers had a Camaro. And as I'm walking by, the water's all down, but they open up their car door, and it was like watching a cartoon because the water was filled up to almost the top of the car, and it just poured out the door. And I just started laughing, and I couldn't stop. I think I laughed the whole way home because it looked just like something out of like Bugs Bunny. And I got back to my dorm, but it didn't matter because the Hassans had enough money. They just got a new Camaro.
That's the problem with those T-tops. Those old T-tops were not reliable in the rain at all.
But yeah, opening that door and the water just pouring out, I just went like, you couldn't do that any better than it, just it like a movie or a cartoon where it just worked that way.
So moving on, let's go to best performance, is where we left off. Dad, who do you have down?
I have Tom Hanks.
I also have Hanks. Anyone else?
It's Gary Sinise for me.
Sarah?
Actually, I agree. That was my choice.
All right, so we'll take the Hanks perspective first. Dad, why Tom Hanks?
It is so... I mean, it set Tom Hanks as being the Mr. Everybody. I think this film made Tom Hanks clearly the next generation's Jimmy Stewart. And he became kind of like one of the most impactful actors of his generation from this film. Simply because his performance transcended. It would have been easy to make the character buffoonish. He didn't. He undersold the entire film or the whole portrayal. And made it somebody you not only that you didn't laugh at, but you laughed with more.
I think the character, I would agree, is the linchpin, obviously, of the film, being the titular character, but he also becomes, as Joe mentioned earlier, your underdog story, your Rudy, your guy that you're constantly rooting for throughout the film. And part of the reason that I think that this movie has to rely so much on Hanks is, if I were critical of anything, it's that I don't feel there's a lot of directorial flair to this. Like, there's a little bit of a tone where you get in a lot of Zemeckis films that's kind of earnest, wholesome, kind of like Capra-esque. But at the same time, there's really no real great camera flourishes. He's not doing anything overly artistic with where he's placing it, how he's tracking things, anything that's like, above normal. He's fine. He's replacement level. But what is there that's like really special about the direction necessarily in this film? I think, to me, it says more that he kind of just sat behind the camera and let Tom Hanks do his thing. And part of the reason that people love this movie is, and by extension, I think came to love Tom Hanks, is he becomes the stand-in for everybody, not only to perceive the movie, perceive him, perceive disability, but perceive America as how he's experiencing these things throughout the movie. It's from the narration, it's from his acting, it's from his interactions with people during the course of the movie. I just think so much is reliant on Tom Hanks to be really good in this movie that it doesn't work without him. And so for me, if this category is not necessarily MVP, the obvious sports term, but it kind of could be in this one circumstance.
Well, let me just carry your analogy. Zemeckis is like mayo. Okay? It's there and you can taste it and it adds to it, but it's not like a significant portion of the sandwich. Tom Hanks is the steak in the sandwich.
Okay. I somewhat disagree with mayo. I like a good portion of mayo on mine, but I think also mayo is too disagreeable for the general public to be perceived as that. But we'll move on. Now, I will say, Gary Sinise was my most charismatic, because for a guy that's a foul-mouthed kind of captain leader, and this is after an era where we've seen all of these like hard military guys, Louis Gossett Jr. and R. Lee Ermey, trying to be these dicks in the military. And this guy loses his legs. He's very angry and aggressive, and yet he becomes somewhat of a triumphant, overcoming character. And so I do find him endlessly charismatic. But why do you guys have him in best performance?
Okay. Well, first I want to say what his character is going through overall. I mean, he's introduced as this for lack of a better word, charismatic commanding officer, in Vietnam. That's like our first image of him. And then immediately we're put forth of this image of him as this is a man who understands and whose family understands the entire prospect of, sacrificing everything for one's country. And not only does Gary Sinise pull this off of this character who wants to honor his ancestors and go the same way, you can actually, through the film, see it in his face and his reactions to things, watch him deal with the pain of not only not getting what he wanted out of life, but being saved by someone and then being mutilated in the process, and losing his legs and losing what he thought he may have had if he had survived Vietnam, and ending up in this completely other world. And even then, the first time he and Forrest spend time together in over New Year's, following his accident, you can see him rise to Forrest's defense, and just understand that, hey, I'm going through stuff, but so is he, and I have trigger points of things I don't want brought up, but so does he, and so I'm going to defend him tooth and nail because this is a man that is worth that to me. And you can kind of watch him process all of this across his face in almost every scene that you watch him do, right down to the I never thanked you for saving my life. You can watch him process the guilt over that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's a hard thing to do as an actor.
Oh yeah. And seeing him so proud at the end to introduce his wife to Forrest, where it's almost like this reveal for Lieutenant Dan, and I don't know, that hit me for some reason, but he was just excited to say, hey, look what I've done to better myself or improve myself. But his arc was one that was very one-dimensional military guy. I'm gonna take a crap in the middle of everybody being out here in the area where we're getting set up and ready for our next battle. And he went from that to one of the few characters who didn't need anything from Forrest. The coach needed something from him. The military wanted things out of him. But he went from he needed Forrest to just do his job in the military to later realizing that he kind of saw a better person in himself when he was around Forrest because of Forrest's like genuine acts of kindness, and he had no ulterior motive. And then Dan came around to, I'm around you for no motive, and I'm going to help you and take care of, help be another person. And I think we saw Jenny and of course Forrest's mom and Bubba were three characters who were just genuinely perfect with Forrest from the get-go. But Lieutenant Dan had a real arc in terms of coming around on, because everybody else that interacted with Forrest needed something from him, or it was in passing. I think Dan had probably my favorite arc out of the crew.
Brief aside, but did anybody notice the poignancy of the fact that his fiancée was Asian? I knew so many guys who came out of World War II. I had a neighbor who was a survivor of the Bataan Death March and spent 4 years in a Japanese prison. And he was so racist when it came to anybody who looked like they may be Japanese. And I knew so many Vietnam era veterans who were so racist towards Asian Americans, even because of the perception and the PTSD associated with it. The fact that he's now, I think that was designed to show the level of his reclamation in the film.
Yeah.
Well, to build off of what you're saying, I think it's his own, to call back to, I guess, another film, it's him, like Saving Private Ryan, is, I was worthy of saving. You did this for me. I want to show you that I am, you know, I'm worthy of that. I'm a good man kind of mentality. And I know a lot of veterans that have that of, you know, I want to be worthy of what you other people did for me. And so I kind of see that through his character.
Go ahead if you want to add in, Joe. You were going to say something.
I lost it already. I was already trying to think about who my secondary performance was. If I can nominate a soundtrack, I don't know if you've ever had that happen.
Oh yeah,
no, but I've done it for charismatic.
Yeah, I guess I could kick us off on secondary performance.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, it's the soundtrack for me. The CCR guitar riff on Fortunate Son, or Hendrix's Along the Watchtower, Buffalo Springfield. I mean, so many songs on the soundtrack. To me, and just to jump ahead real fast, Hanks is my most charismatic, but we can talk about that in a moment. But I think the soundtrack for me just made it, as someone who in my youth identified by the music that I knew or could tell you about or listened to or brooded upon. The music really redeems so much of any of the shortcomings for the movie for me that it becomes one of those things that I can't even, like, I can't be mad about it. I'm like, well, you know what? They had that amazing soundtrack. It can do no wrong at this point. But for me, that's definitely what could have been the budget for just the music alone. And then to still get all of the big names. I mean, you've got Robin Wright and you've got Hanks and Sinise and Sally Field. I mean, Lord, it's the names were insane. And to still have that budget for, I mean, I guess, of course, they got on the cutting room floor some major scenes that I loved. But yeah, for me, it's the soundtrack for secondary performance. I think that makes a lot of the tone and helps with the transitions. As ham-fisted as some of the scenes can seem, the music redeems those jumps from one thing to another, or in the timeline. I think it helps with those transitions.
I'm definitely not enough of a music historian to be able to really place my finger on this. But as I was watching it, and it's been a while since I've watched Forrest Gump, but there was a part of me that wondered if a lot of my associations with different historical periods and all the films that kind of like copy certain songs with associations with Vietnam or the Reagan era or certain times of the 70s is somewhat copying this movie because of America's association with all of those songs throughout the course of this film.
Yeah, I cannot hear Fortunate Son without envisioning and hearing a helicopter. Like, and you would think I went to war and had that song playing at the same time, but it's literally, this movie has it just embedded in my brain. And that is, I mean, that's something that's immensely powerful, especially the music, the relationship between music and movies.
I'll make my secondary quick here. I went with the screenwriter Eric Roth for the simple fact that the adaptation from the book to the movie, I think, is one of the key parts of what makes this movie actually tick. If people are familiar with the book, it's even more outlandish than even the movie, which gets criticized for all of its, like, how did he end up at Watergate and tattling on the burglars and also being a ping pong champion and meeting Elvis and doing all of these random things all at the same time. The book is even more ridiculous. Like, I want to say Forrest goes to space or some ridiculous thing like that. So because he takes this book that could be very cartoonish and draws it back to something that's a lot more grounded, a lot more human, I give him a lot of credit for why this movie, I think, resonated so much. Because at a certain point, I don't think people would have bought in to this movie and might have just lost people in the way that the ending kind of brings you back in. I mean, we were talking about how the running scenes probably could have been cut. If you're throwing him in, like, space, or he's somehow like having a run-in with Magic Johnson in 1979 or something random like that. I don't remember if that's part of the book, but those things would just be beyond the pale at a certain point in time.
Yeah. What is this, Fast and Furious? We're going to space?
So I give him a lot of credit for why this movie ended up working as it did. Dad, who was your secondary?
I had Gary Sinise, and it was close. Because I'm just, to be perfectly honest, after this film, I became such a Gary Sinise fan. Thought he was just phenomenal. Apollo 13, he was great. And a mini series, if you can see it, is Truman, based on David McAuliffe's book, where Gary Sinise is Truman. Just phenomenal work. And he, I think, is probably a very underrated actor.
I actually had Robin Wright for this. So I know that's not somebody that we've necessarily discussed prior, but her character has so many layers, and she portrayed it well, that she had to be more of a support system to both the entire storyline as well as Forrest's character, as she is continually brought up throughout the entire film. And without her, in a lot of these moments, a lot of the story would kind of be dead. And you've said it yourself, after she's gone, it you have this sense of a lull in the storyline. And I think to an extent everybody feels that, because a big part of the story is his love for Jenny, even down to the shrimp boat he names after her and everything. But it's these moments like her praying to get away from her dad's house, the young Jenny character, even though it's not necessarily Robin Wright who's portraying it. It's the standing on the balcony while high above this rushing street. It's not only believable, but it's supporting the fact that this is a character who's in turmoil, who's going through all of these things, who needs help. And that is always what Forrest's character is. That's who he is as an individual, as we see throughout the film. So I think she does that well.
For a generation of films that we've often criticized on this program for being unkind to women in how they're written, they either are in a very supporting role where they're just either moving the plot along, or they're coming in with certain lines to just further the title character. She has somewhat of her own story arc, even if tragic. But the other part of it is, you're talking about the turmoil. She has to, whether it's the younger Jenny or Robin Wright throughout the rest of the film, not only be kind to Forrest and be believable, but then not know how to be capable of being kind to herself. And I think that in an era where we didn't quite understand a lot of those things is much more difficult than I think 30 years on we probably give credit for. Most charismatic, I already gave mine. So let's start with Sarah. Who did you have?
I actually had that as Tom Hanks. His character, because of his charisma and his charm, is what made, I think, Forrest believable. So he's not somebody that you're going to look down on. He's somebody that not only, as Dad said, you laugh with, but he's somebody you care for and you're rooting for throughout the film. And a lot of that has to do with the day in, their day out way he interacts with everybody around him. And he does his best in order to not only be kind, but to bring joy to people. He, in the hospital is bringing Lieutenant Dan ice cream because he thinks that's something that might make him smile. And I think that's charming. It's something that everybody needs. It's something that is so relatable, is having that kooky friend in your life who is just there to make you smile when you need it.
Yeah, definitely Hanks as the most charismatic. I mean, he's up there in my favorite actors, and I don't think that you could have given much to your notes that this movie doesn't work without Hanks. I don't think it can, and I think it's his nature of delivering the lines that he does and the tone that he does. And there is you can get it's just a little bit above and a little bit below the line of where of whatever's going on in the scene, but you can catch the sadness or the happiness or and I hate to say the ignorance is bliss moments, like bringing ice cream for Lieutenant Dan, or just not taking offense to something. I don't know. I think there's so much that Hanks did in that role that makes it more charismatic, even though it is I think it obviously it's a complex role, but what he brought to it definitely helped make it that of the film. And I don't think anybody thinks of anybody other than Hanks when they think of Forrest Gump. So it's definitely, for me, I think that just did so much charm wise, and definitely the secret sauce for the movie, I think.
I'm a believer that everyone in life has a superpower. Some people never really discover it or understand it, but I think everybody does. And there are some people that superpower is they just fill a camera. There's a lot of actors who are really good on Broadway or local theater, but they're not movie stars. And it's the ability to fill a screen. And Tom Hanks has that. And that's why I have him as most charismatic. There are just some people that have that knack. And he just comes across that way. And not only is that knack that he fills the screen, he builds a connection with you that I can't describe. It's when you watch Tom Hanks in any film, you can see yourself almost in that situation. He becomes your surrogate as to being in that film and doing the role yourself and living your life. You can see yourself experiencing being bullied. You can see yourself having physical challenges. You can see yourself having periods of great success and then, being constantly rejected at love, etc. That's what the film is. And without that ability, I could throw out some names. John Cryer. Could John Cryer have done this part? No. Let's John Lithgow. Okay, fine actor. And on parts, I would say he's probably a movie star, but depends on the role. You're not going to get him to have the same connection. And so I can name dozens of male actors who would not have the same level of connection and be able to draw this script to your own life experience.
Yeah,
and that is ultimately what charisma is about, which is the ability to render feelings of you feel more important by being in the presence of this person.
Yeah, and I think they would have done a disservice, because if they wouldn't have gotten Hanks, would they have gone a comedic route and gotten somebody like a Billy Crystal, which then this movie would be talked on a podcast of worst movies of all time, right? Like they couldn't have kept the tone with a different actor, and and Hanks absolutely toes that line between he can have fun, but he can be very dramatic at the same time. And yeah, I completely agree with everything you threw out there.
I think that's where his sitcom background has a little bit of advantageousness to it. And the fact that he'd already made, I don't know how many different comedic films by this point as well.
Bachelor Party. If you haven't seen Bachelor Party and you want a good time just sitting down some night, watch Bachelor Party. It's hilarious.
That might be the only time that ever gets recommended or brought up on this show.
Yeah, probably.
All right, let's go to best scene then. I have 5 nominees ready for us, and then you guys can add more if needed. I have Run, Forrest, Run, which is the early scenes when he's a younger boy. He's running away from the bullies or whatever. And I think that kind of needed to be put in here, not only for the character building just generally, but also for knowing kind of, obviously there's callbacks to it throughout the film, whether it's him being a football player, whether it's him later in the film being kind of a cross-country runner, quite literally. I do think that's important to building who this character is, and also how he just will follow any order, seemingly, because that's important in Vietnam, and it's important in ping pong as well. Gotta Save Bubba. Obviously a very key scene to the film. We've kind of generally discussed it a few times. I have Bubba Gump Shrimp Strikes It Big. So when everybody else's boat has apparently capsized, and this is somehow seemingly the only one that is left to take advantage of all the shrimp there are in Louisiana, and they're just running amok.
So silly, but yeah.
Then I have Running Cross Country, which we've talked about, and then I have Little Forest. Do you guys have any ones that you want to add on?
I actually have the moment where post Medal of Honor receiving Forrest Gump gets swept up into the anti-Vietnam rally. I really enjoy that scene. It's impactful and fun, but also it sends a message of many of the veterans that came back from Vietnam.
Anyone else?
I don't know why it hit me, but just him, and I'll bring it up in my quotes too, but him talking about all the different kinds of rain is a favorite for me. And that may be a weird like of the movie, but I just love that because it perfectly describes all the different kinds of rain that you could interact with. And then it's like, and then one day it stopped. And that's just such a, I don't know, just it seems like a trend in the movie too.
All right, so your final nominees then are Run, Forrest, Run, Raining in Vietnam, Gotta Save Bubba, Anti-War Rally, Bubba Gump Shrimp Strikes It Big, Running Cross Country, and Little Forest. What is the best scene, Dad?
Run, Forrest, Run. It sets the entire tone of the movie. To me, anyway. It tells you who he is, what's going on, what he's facing, and everything after that is juxtaposed against that limited childhood.
I think I can agree that Gotta Save Bubba can't happen if he's not running. Just Keep Going can't happen if he's not the hitting it big on the shrimp boat. I don't know, all of these things can't happen without a Run, Forrest, Run.
I would agree. Not only does it set up the character, but it also sets him up for the willpower and the determination to get out and get past these things. And it sets up his character to be seen by many people as themselves. And I think that's incredibly impactful.
And while I agree all of those things are important, I think we have kind of glossed over the fact that a lot of the early portion of this movie kind of works really well together, and I think you could take it as a whole. What I find to be the most impactful or the linchpin moment of the film is, especially after we've had kind of this lull we've all discussed in the first segment of the show, where we kind of have this downer thing and it gets a little bit boring around the cross-country run. I mean, that's memorable, but it's not necessarily how to end the film. We have to believe that we've been in this bus bench or whatever for a reason. And to have that payoff of what Little Forrest was, after we had such a heartbreaking moment with Jenny leaving him, you have to pay that off in some regard. So to have the introduction of his son, and then the tragedy that goes with it, that she's sick, and she's going to finally willingly allow herself to be taken care of by Forrest. I think that's the perfect way to bring us all back around and remind us why we find this story important. Because if you don't have that ending, you can have as great a beginning as you want. And I do remember my freshman band teacher always commanding, people don't necessarily remember the middle. You can screw up a lot in the middle. They remember how you begin and how you end. And to me, great films often have really great openings and really killer endings. And to me, bringing that back around is just as important as defining the character early in the movie. So Little Forest for me would be my best scene. My favorite scene, Gotta Save Bubba. I think it is comedic somehow in its tragedy, and yet it's probably the defining scene that doesn't involve Jenny. He makes a connection, a lifelong connection with Lieutenant Dan. You get your final moments with his best friend. You get that he's a Medal of Honor recipient, and you get how he's going to start his business. There's so much wrapped up into that few moments. And I think all of us, to a degree, even if you've never experienced it, can relate to, I can't find my friend. Where's my friend?
I'm going to go wrap it back to Forrest getting stuck in the line for the anti-war rally. Honestly, because not only is it funny, but I think we've all been in that moment of, what the fuck am I doing right now? And then, not only that, but he gets up and he actually says something, and everybody around him is saying, oh, that's so profound, even though the mic's out at the time.
Yep.
And that's the moment where he really reconnects with Jenny, too. So I think that is overall important to the story arc. So it's comedy, but it's profound. He says something that's obviously important, and he talks about his time in the military from a very personal place, which, even though we can't hear it, we understand. And then he gets to reconnect with this person that's this overarching story throughout the entire film.
I gotta say, I do love the running cross-country scene. Now, I don't think I could run across the entire country, but and I do run, I do distance running, and there is something about just, I don't know, I just started running one day, and I just kept going, and I couldn't stop, and then you're like, nah, I think that's it, I'm done. And I love that simplicity of it, and everybody trying to read into what he's doing, and why are you doing this, and is this for world peace, and all these grander things, and he's like, no, I just wanted to go for a run. But then later, after Little Forest comes into the picture, then he talks about the things that he saw on his run, and there's runner's high and all that kind of stuff that you get, but just being out in nature and the scenery that they show, and there's not a lot of great cinematography or framing or shots, but some of those shots are just the natural elements of the mountains and all the stuff that he sees are gorgeous. And then even the way he describes it comes back around. And then as a small, quick runner-up, young Forrest making fun of his principal and the sounds he makes when he says, your mama sure does care about your schooling. I think, and it is a silly moment and it's hilarious, but it's also one of those times where you can say, Forrest is not an idiot. He's not ignorant to everything that's going on. He knows what's going on, and he gets to make fun of you for this moment that you think you're just walking out, thinking you're the king right now. And this little kid gets to make fun of you when you were just talking about how he's below par or under the bar of what your standards are. And I found that hilarious in multiple ways, but that to me sets the bar of like, okay, it's not this stupid person. He appears that way, but he knows what's going on in the back.
For me, I again went with Run Forrest Run as my favorite scene. Same basic principles, simply because it makes a connection with most of America. And I mean, we've all been in those situations. I can think back on riding the bus to junior high and such, and yeah, it was just not a great experience. I guess as long as I'm talking, I'll go to my most indelible moment, which is it'll always be Gotta Say Bubba, because it's the most exciting, most stimulating moment in the film, where it's war at its ultimate, and it's no thought of your own safety. You're just trying to do what you think is right. You're trying to save your friend. And it just happens that all of a sudden you realize all these other guys that you are in the group with need saving, and you start acting. To me, it just is because it connects with me, because it's in large part where I have a tendency to lean my life towards, which is always trying to chase after the circumstances where I'm going to make the most impact and try to rescue somebody or some situation.
And I completely agree with that. That's what I was going to say too. And for very similar reasons, especially after dealing with so many people within the military community, not only in my time in school, but outside of it, those that I have chosen to call friends and associate myself with. So many of them do this kind of thing without thinking twice about it. And it's interesting because not only is it just a commonplace action of, okay, I'm going to do this whether or not you tell me not to. I'm going to go do this because this is something important to me. And it's that moment of Lieutenant Dan even ordering him to stay back. You are going to likely die in this. And then running headfirst into that, you know, especially as somebody who has spent so much time studying Medal of Honor recipients. There's so many of them that ran headfirst into danger, knowing that without a shadow of a doubt that they were certain to likely die, and then doing it anyway. I think that's incredibly powerful. Doing that for a friend, I think, just makes it even more so. That's something that's relatable, is, you know, those close friends that we value with everything in our lives are so important that, you know, we can see that. And while we might not ever be in that situation ourselves, I think some people can relate to it.
As far as indelible moments, pure unforgettable moments of this movie, it's gotta be Forrest in Jenny's dorm room. He ejaculates on her roommate's robe, and then she's like, "Oh, don't worry about it. I don't like her anyway," or whatever she says. And then the roommate is wide awake, just completely traumatized by the whole situation. You know, the Princess Bride is in here. This happens. The roommate's robe. It's insane. Like, if they were going to cut any scene, that could have probably been the one. But so sorry for the major tonal shift in terms of moments of the movie, but that one's a wild one.
That's what makes this show wonderful.
I'll just make mine short and sweet.
I see you licking your lips there, Tom. You don't need to get so annoyed.
I just remember the ending. Really, if I think about the movie, as many memorable things as there are about this film, and so many lines and things that just hit a cultural touchstone and were shared multiple times over. To me, the ending, because it's as impactful as it is, and it ends on that note, was the thing that I knew throughout the course of the film. It colors everything else as you rewatch it. So that's my most indelible. So that looks like a good spot to take our second break. We will be right back. Before we jump back into the episode, and before we get to the Stanley Rubric in a minute, if you're ever curious about our Master Greatest Movies of All Time list that has every graded movie we've ever discussed on the show, there's a link in the episode description of every episode of this show, or you can go to RonnieDuncanStudios.com and find it as the top entry on the Greatest Movies of All Time podcast show page. That is the grades we've done so far for all 199 movies we've graded, and we continue to add more each week. Make sure to check that out as we go and follow along. Also, you can follow each individual episode on our website as well. That has the notes for each individual episode with all of our scores, category nominations, and the individual factoids for each episode of the show. Just click the link in the episode description of this episode or go to RonnieDuncanStudios.com/Gmote podcast to find that. Dad, do we have anyone to remember this week?
Tomeo Perry, 49, American actor, surfer, was in Pirates of the Caribbean. Evans, 91, American actress, was in Bonnie and Clyde, The Iceman Cometh, and Dead Bang. Taylor Wiley, 56, American actor, was in the new Hawaii Five-0, the movie Forgetting Sarah Marshall, and the new Magnum P.I. He was also a sumo wrestler. Billy Cobbs, 90, American actor. That Thing You Do, The Ghosts of Mississippi, The Hudsucker Proxy, and Night at the Museum. Jamie Kellner, 77, American television executive. Worked at Fox, the WB, TNT, TBS, and CNN at Turner. Jonathan Moreno, 56, American television writer. Worked for The Late Late Show with Craig Ferguson. Russell Morash, 88, American television producer and director. Creator of This Old House, producer for The French Chef and The Victory Garden. And then lastly, Donald Sutherland, 88, American actor. Was in the movie MASH, in Animal House, Backdraft, Clute, Ordinary People. Won a Primetime Emmy in 1995. He also won a Lifetime Oscar. I just want to take a moment to spend a little extra time with Donald Sutherland simply because he is one of the great character actors of a generation. I first learned of Donald Sutherland when he was in The Dirty Dozen, and I watched that with my dad as a small child. It was one of my dad's favorite movies. Another film my dad introduced me to, he was late at night. I was tired. Must have been a Saturday. My mom went to bed, and I was still up yet. I must have been about 11 or 12. And he sat me down and made me watch Kelly's Heroes. It made no sense to begin with, but, Don Rickles, Donald Sutherland, Clint Eastwood, and Gavin MacLeod, etc. The film JFK, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. He was in the Hunger Games franchise. He did Clute, Backdraft, A Time to Kill. He was in Space Cowboys and Cold Mountain. He's one of the actors who seemed to have as broad of a palette of filmmaking as you could get. Last Friday, Chris, my wife, who's on the show on a regular basis, and I watched Ordinary People. It was the first time I'd actually seen the film.
Really?
Yes.
I love that film, and we're covering it next year, so okay.
Yeah. And I absolutely loved it. And I was amazed that of all the people in the film, he's the one who didn't get nominated. I thought his performance was the most exceptional. He had to portray a level of innocence and love and, I don't know, myopathy. That he didn't see what was going on around him.
Not to undercut what we will eventually cover next year, because I really do appreciate that film, and I think it's generally underrated by most film people. But the roles of the parents are reversed from the traditional roles. where Mary Tyler Moore is much more of the like unsympathetic, hard parent that's usually portrayed by fathers. Instead, Donald Sutherland kind of takes the motherly, nurturing, soft-spoken role. And I think that's what made the film a lot more unique, at least to me. And I think that's why he gets short shrift. The other parts are much meatier. You have much more to peel back, where Sutherland, if you're not looking for it, can probably come off as one note.
But I've done a lot of, spent the last week since his passing watching several of his films. Not only did I watch Ordinary People, I've watched in bits and pieces Kelly's Heroes, The Dirty Dozen again, which we've already covered once, JFK, Path to War, which was a HBO film that was made where he's playing Clark Clifford. Just phenomenal actor. It's a great loss that we've lost him, but I think he really provided a great opportunity for us to enjoy films, characters, and an actor who truly tried to do the best with the script and the person that he was portraying. I know we'll give us a round of silence, or a moment of silence, I should say, to all who have contributed to the arts tonight. But for him, I just wanted to spend a little extra time discussing him, because he's one of those actors that whenever I saw him in a film, I thought more of the film as a result of him.
And not to belabor the point, but we've spent the last couple of weeks talking about actors who took the points. He's one of the very few examples where somebody didn't take the points and would probably regret it.
Animal House. Because, why am I drawing a blank as to the actor, or the director of Animal House?
It's not Ramis, is it?
No. He ended up in trouble for the Twilight. Yep, John Landis. The studio came to John Landis and said, there's some things missing. We need a star for this film, Animal House. And he says, well, I do know somebody. I used to babysit for this guy who's a big actor. And so they said, okay, well, can you get him? And so Landis went to Donald Sutherland because he used to babysit for Kiefer. And Sutherland had a choice of 2% of the profit or his daily rate, which I think came out to about $100,000. I want to say the 2% was like $11 million or $10 million, something like that. So, yeah, always take the points. You never know what Americans will find to be great.
I will give a little extra attention to two people on this list that I guess I feel a little bit more of a connection to. So Taylor Willie, I love Forgetting Sarah Marshall. It's probably one of my favorite rom-coms of all time. It hit me. It was released like right as I was coming out of high school, going into college, and it's got some of that raunchy humor to it, but I love Jason Segel, love Mila Kunis. It just was always one of my favorites. So he has kind of a memorable small bit role that he makes the most out of in that film. And so that one's a little bit personally felt. The other one, and it was a very late addition today, Bill Cobbs. The requisite that guy. If you don't know who that is, that's fine, because I wouldn't have known him by name either. But the minute that you look up his picture, you're like, oh, that guy. I love that guy. He was in everything. He is literally the guy you never knew his name, but showed up, and every time that he showed up, you were happy for it. So just another quick shout out to him. And so we remember these here fondly with a moment of silence in their honor. Thank you. And if you want any more information, you can find their obituaries linked on our website. Let's go to best funniest lines. This may take a while, I'll just say. I will start with the very obvious. My mama always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get.
Lieutenant Dan, have you found Jesus yet, Gump? Forrest, I didn't know I was supposed to be looking for him, sir.
I've been running for 3 years, 2 months, 14 days, and 16 hours. And then he absolutely stops and says, I'm pretty tired now. I think I'll go home.
Forrest, sorry I had a fight in the middle of your Black Panther party.
I'll do another obvious one because no one's taken it yet. Run, Forrest, run!
That was my next one. Forrest, Mama always said dying was part of life. I sure wish it wasn't.
Bubba was my best good friend, and even I know that ain't something that you can find around the corner.
Forrest, it happens. The bumper sticker man. What? Shit? Forrest, sometimes.
Apparently, I'm just going to take all the really obvious ones. Stupid is as stupid does.
Forrest, my mama always said you gotta put the past behind you before you can move on.
They said it was $1 million wound, but the army must keep that money, because I ain't seen a nickel of that $1 million.
Lieutenant Dan. Well, thought I'd try out my sea legs. Forrest. Well, you ain't got no legs, Lieutenant Dan.
Do you ever dream, Forrest, about who you're going to be? Who I'm going to be? Yeah. Aren't I going to be me?
Forrest, Mama said there's only so much fortune a man can really needs, and the rest is just for showing off. So I gave a whole bunch of it to Foursquare Gospel Church, and I gave a whole bunch to Bayou Labatt Fishing Hospital. And even though Bubba was dead, and Lieutenant Dan said I was nuts, I gave Bubba's mama Bubba's share. And you know what? She didn't have to work in nobody's kitchen no more.
One of my favorites. I don't know if we have a destiny, or if we're all just floating around accidental, like on a breeze. But I think maybe it's both.
I'm going to abstain from the voice. So, Forrest in the war, a little bit of stinging rain and big old fat rain, rain that flew in sideways, and sometimes rain that seemed to come straight up from underneath.
Forrest, if I'd have known that would be the last time I was going to talk to Bubba, I would have thought of something better to say.
What I think every human quests. Forrest, me and Jenny goes together like peas and carrots.
Bubba was going to be a shrimping boat captain, but instead he died right there by that river in Vietnam.
The principal, your mama sure does care about your education, son.
I'm not a smart man, but I know what love is.
I don't remember being born. I don't recall what I got for my first Christmas. And I don't know when I went on my first outdoor picnic. But I do remember the first time I heard the sweetest voice in the wide world.
Drill Sergeant. Gump! What's your sole purpose in this army? To do whatever you tell me, Drill Sergeant! God damn it, Gump! You're a goddamn genius! This is the most outstanding answer I have ever heard! You must have a goddamn IQ of 160! You are goddamn gifted, Private Gump! We only knew it was that easy.
Yeah.
Do you have any left, Sarah?
I've got just the one. And as everybody in my family knows, I can relate hard to this. What's normal anyways?
All right, let's go to the Stanley rubric then. Legacy is up first. For those that are new to the show, legacy is a measure of everything from 5 years beyond the release of this film, so that would be 1999 and beyond. And it is primarily measured on the backs of how the industry and the general audience view this film. Now, this can mean a lot of different things. This has been interpreted in quite a few different ways. But Dad, so as not to put our guests on the spot, would you like to go first or second?
I'll go first. The industry still loves this film. It's on everybody's great films list. You can kind of shake your head no if you want, but it's still on that list. And the incredible part of the legacy of this is Winston Groom this novel did not do that well. It did great after the film. The sequel, which was barely any, made a blip, became a bestseller. And Winston Groom went on to have a very successful later career as a military historian. In fact, I have, I think, 3 different books Winston Groom wrote. One was about the Battle of Vicksburg, one was about the Battle of Gettysburg, and then I think he wrote one book about the Second World War. So I think it's still considered to be a significant work. For the industry, I gave it a 5. Legacy, I think the public remembers lines about the film more than they remember the film. But I still think there's a large portion of the population that's seen the film, appreciates the film, and likes the film. So for the public overall, I gave it a 4 for a 9 overall.
Okay. I will say that in one degree, you've slightly made me reevaluate, only to the extent that in our conversation tonight, we've kind of insinuated that Tom Hanks became America's darling primarily on the backing of this film. And if for nothing else, I will raise from what my original score was a 0.5 point to a 4 comparatively. I just think that there are too many film bros out here hating on this film for it to get a complete 5 from the industry. It's just, there are too many people reevaluating this thing and thinking that it's crap comparatively. Now, on a audience side, as much as this was a cultural phenomenon in the United States, it did not extend much beyond our borders. It is somewhat internationally known, but it really was kind of an Americanized or American-centric thing. And I'll also put it that it's waned over time comparatively to some of the same films from the 90s that came out. And so while Hanks is a bigger for it, like, since this film, Robert Zemeckis has basically had the ability to do whatever he wanted, and just about every other film has been panned. What exactly are we getting out of this deal? I guess maybe Robin Wright and Gary Sinise go on to have bigger careers, but that's also part of the industry. I have kind of a 4 for that, so I would have an 8. So Sarah or Joe, which of you would like to try here?
I'll jump in. I mean, this is on so many lists of top movies. On the industry side, I like breaking this up into 2 parts. I think there's still a load of nostalgia for it, even on the industry side, but I think I can agree on a 4. I think on the public legacy, since cutting the cord, since getting streamers, this movie's not in front of a lot of people. I think people could go back and look at Oscar winners if they want to, I think. But I think that there's enough tone deafness that doesn't read as nostalgia for any younger millennial, any Zoomer, or any alphas that are watching this on, I guess we could plug, it's on Paramount Plus if you want to go watch it. But I think I'm going to, because my love comes back for it here and there, I'm going to give it maybe a generous 3 to give my legacy a 7 total score. But I think those who didn't grow up with it are going to be lower, and those who did are going to love it for the nostalgia that they've got.
So I've really struggled with this one because I think the legacy is intact. I mean, this is still a movie that, when you bring it up, people still love it. So, and that was even more well noted to me as I talked about the fact that I was watching this. I watched it over a week in the lunchroom at work, and everybody was like, "Oh, what are you watching?" And it struck up conversations. because so many people not only recognized it, but loved that movie and were talking about, different parts of it that they enjoyed. So I think the legacy of the movie is still there, and same with its rewatchability. So, I gave Legacy a 9.
So that's an 8.25 average between the four of us. All right, let's go to impact and significance. I'll just say this. I have it at a 10. I think that we've argued basically it was a critical darling at the time. It was one of the biggest movies of all time, and that particular year, it struck a chord, at least in America. I would have a hard time, especially with the industry having it less than a 5, given the Tom Hanks, Sinise, Zemeckis, Robin Wright of it all, that this wasn't at least a 5 on that level. And on an audience side, the lines were quoted everywhere. So I'll ask this maybe to speed us along a little bit, because this recording is another gigantic one. But does anyone have less than a 10?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Dad, you also had a 10?
Yes. I'll leave it at that.
So, our guess, why did you have less than a 10?
I think it's lost its charm over the years. And
to be fair, this is a category that is the 5 years. So Legacy measures 5 years and later. This is the initial 5 years. So this would be 1994 to 1999. If that
does help. I think that changes my score then in terms of, I don't think you can find a more quotable movie. I think for that era, I got to agree with a 10.
I think even Hanks himself had other films that talked about similar issues that are still during that time having those kinds of important conversations. Help me out here. What was the movie with him having AIDS?
Philadelphia, that he won the best actor for the year before.
Yeah. So Philadelphia is an example of this. It's an important movie that talks about the same kind of trauma. It talks about death and sickness and very personal issues that there are parts of this that discuss. And I think that one has a significance that is more resounding in the 90s, especially when you look at what was going on throughout the 90s, from everything historically as far as the Anita Hill trials to everything else in the 90s. There was other work by Tom Hanks that was also incredibly significant. And I have a hard time saying that this is like the epitome of him and his career, because Saving Private Ryan is in there too, and it's all of these other films and moments and significant touchstones that, are still touchstones, even though it's now, because I'm not saying that it's, the same thing as Legacy. I have a hard time giving it over a 6 or a 7. So I'm going to go with a 6.5.
I'm not saying entirely that this relies on Tom Hanks becoming the new star on the block. He'd done Splash. He'd been doing movies for almost a decade by this point. He had already won one Best Actor the year prior. He'd done Sleepless in Seattle. He'd done Joe versus the Volcano. But even so, like, he'd had a career, but this places him on a different pedestal. This is allowing him to get a personal favorite of mine, That Thing You Do, his first directorial film, off the ground. This allows him to come back with Apollo 13 and be one of the biggest movies of the following year. It allows him to work with Steven Spielberg for the first time, even though then they'd been friends, to do Saving Private Ryan. It allows him with Zemeckis to do Castaway. And it puts him in A-list territory status pretty much ongoing after this film comes out.
My argument, though, is that because of all of those other things that it sets up, this movie does, to a small extent, get drowned out in.
Really throwing off the average.
Yeah.
So that's a 9.13 between the four of us. Novelty. I've been playing with splitting this between originality and execution. That's not a prerequisite for this category. So I'll just give mine quickly. I think on an originality side, it's an adaptation from the book. We've kind of spoken out of both sides of our mouth when it comes to book adaptations or play adaptations before, where sometimes we feel it's really original and sometimes it's not. I will say that it is much different than the book as I understand it, and why I nominated Eric Roth before for Best Secondary Performance. So I do think that there is something to be said for that. And while I think you could kind of place Hanks in a similar scenario as Rain Man from just a few years prior to this, it doesn't feel completely new in that regard. At least the, I would say, superheroic disabled guy. It is kind of lacking a true unicorn factor. And so I have a 3.5 for originality. As far as the execution, I already said the direction is lacking a bit for me. Some of the cinematography is just straight out bland. But the acting, the screenplay, the technical execution from a set design, costuming, even to a degree the score, although it relies a lot more on the soundtrack than the actual score, I think the execution on some of those other areas is where this movie is great. But because of the direction and some of the other things, I would bring it down to a 3. So I have a 6.5.
I think for me overall in Novelty, I mean, the underdog stories are tried and true. They've been done. I know it's adapted from the book. I think overall for Novelty, even thinking about originality and execution, I'm looking at a 6. I do love the fun of, like I said, the Easter eggs, the Rick Dalton moments, the scandals, all of the craziness in there that makes it memorable and novel in that sense. And then looking at some of the stuff today, I mean, some of those voiceovers I remember at the time, not voiceovers, the moving mouth of the president or John Lennon or whoever was in those interviews, and thinking they were amazing, and now they just look like those jib jab cards that you can order of your, a coworker, making them look silly. So I don't think that really a lot of it holds up. However, I think there's enough fun with it that it's like, oh, that was a pretty funny scene or whatever that sticks with people. So I'm a 6.
I appreciate you continuing to mention Rick Dalton, particularly given that we're discussing that film in 3 weeks.
Oh, nice.
So, nice little teaser.
I don't necessarily think that this pushed the boundaries of film any farther forward. But I do think that it did create conversations around different things that people experience. It's the same reason that we, in the last 5-10 years, have pushed so hard for representation in film. This is a early 90s film which is talking about things that are still problems and stuff that we're still dealing with today, and it's almost 30 years later, and we're still having conversations about addiction, and we're having conversations about abuse and women in film and how to make female characters more complex. We're having all of these same kind of conversations, and this solidly fits within that. It was opening doors to have those kinds of conversations back then, which to me is important. It laid a foundation for some of those things to happen. So I gave this a 7.5.
Normally, I start looking at this and I start thinking about the fact that so much of this is Capra. The characters are Capra. Which I find interesting because, meet John Doe, It's a Wonderful Life. I mean, it's the same basic character in at least several of Capra's films. We're talking about James Stewart.
It definitely has You Can't Take It With You vibes.
Yeah. So, so it's not overly novel to that extent. But this is one of the early films that I can remember where women who had these strange lives, these quests to find themselves, where it kind of implicated why they were like that. The circumstances, the heart of why their psychology was so screwed up, the childhood traumas that they had to face. It's also one of the early films where I actually saw the main character transform himself by the events that were going around him. So, even though it wasn't the most novel concept, there was enough there pushing it back up. I went with a 7 for novelty overall.
Ooh, we all got in a range. We had a 6, 6.5, 7, and 7.5.
Do you need help with the math?
I do not. That is a 6.75 average between the four of us.
Okay.
Classicness. Dad, I'll let you lead.
I always start with classicness and around a 7. And as I've already indicated, we have a very strong female lead, which is fresh. Robin Wright nailed her part for what it was. The historic aspect of this was great. Its impact and how it showed his impact on culture in general, and to some extent the silliness of pop culture. So I think it's above the average, but there were things about it that I think it was a little too limiting on what the impact of war was and what exactly, the impact of combat was. I think it soft-sold it a bit. It wasn't the raw element that it could have been because it was more of a comedy. So I have to give it points down. So I went overall for classicness at a 7.5.
Well, my initial score throwing out here was pretty low, and my intention is not to anchor this for any disdain for the movie. But I think when I think of a classic movie, it's a movie that stays as a piece of entertainment, stays timeless almost in its messaging and how it's delivered. I think, yes, there's a ton of nostalgia for this movie, and I have some of that, and I enjoyed watching it. As far as going back to would I enjoy watching it again? I tried to rewatch it earlier this week and had a tough time. But for me, classicness was pretty low because of how poorly some of the pieces aged. It gets made fun of. I guess maybe not made fun of, but referenced in Tropic Thunder. I don't know. I don't feel a lot of this sticking as keeping this a classic movie, other than people with nostalgia and love for it keeping it on lists. So I'm going to bump up a little bit for my initial classicness score. I'm going to go with a 5.
Gonna tie back to my earlier comments, because classicness is, by and large, has this aged well, and were there things that were ahead of their time, and I think there are elements of this that is incredibly true. I mean, we're talking about things that are still hot button issues. AIDS. I mean, with Jenny dying of AIDS, that is still, an issue in the community. It was a much more prevalent at that point in time. but it is still something that it needs to be talked about and looked at, and not necessarily treated with the same kind of fear that was at that point in time, which you know, Hanks was already talking about with Philadelphia. However, we're also talking about sexual abuse of women and addiction and all of the trauma that ties along with this. These, as I don't know if you guys as men can really understand it, but in women's circles, these are things that we are still constantly talking about because, you know, I know so many people that have experienced these things or that have come out the other side of things like this. And so to get to actually watch a character not only wrestle with those issues, but then find something that is the right fit for her life, and she chooses to not only find solace in, but to find, like, not for lack of a better term, a safe space. And to me, that makes it age very well. So I gave this an 8.
As for me, this is where I think that this movie, what it's about, actually tends to work against it, in that we have this magical disabled guy whose circumstances and what happens to him and what he's able to create just doesn't really feel realistic, and maybe sets a poor tone for people actually dealing with a lot of these issues. And while I do credit the film for being very kind to people with disabilities, we mentioned that most of the primary characters are dealing with some sort of either trauma or disability in some regard. There's just a nature where it feels a little too convenient and Hollywood to give these people extraordinary stories so it could be more appealing to a mass audience. If I were to criticize it on anything, it's just the nature of the story seems a little too incredible at times once you really start breaking through it. That this guy from literally nothing could become a multimillionaire, run a giant company, invest in Apple, run cross country and get all over the news, be an Alabama football star, a Medal of Honor recipient, and a ping pong
He's
champion.
Homer Simpson from the episode where Frank Grimes comes in and talks about how much he hates Homer for going to the moon and being in a Beatles type of band. And
I just wonder how ultimately timeless this is going to be, whether it gets introduced to new audiences and they feel the same way that those of us that have a certain level of morality or value system that's based around 90s culture would have. And the more selfish of us that is kind of the individual, rugged individualism that Dad keeps bringing up constantly from this era. I wonder if this movie even resonates with them as much. So while I do, for me, it's a little bit timeless, I just don't know to the public at large. So I ultimately came down at a 6.5. So much like the previous category, we also have a 6.75. Rewatchability. I'll be honest, unless I have to, I likely am probably not putting on this film of my own volition. I might watch it every couple of years because I really don't find anything wrong with it, but it's just not going to be something that I go back to and rewatch constantly. It's just not that movie for me. I have many other 90s movies that I just like more, easier to watch. This movie does have that dull set in the second half that kind of drags a little bit for me, and I do feel some of its length. As far as leaving it on, I have no reason to turn it off immediately, and I would likely watch 5 minutes to a few scenes, but I'm not stopping my day. I'm not making a plan to go out and rewatch it. I'm not doing anything like that, so I have a 2.5 and a 2.5. I have a 5.
I think I'm in the same boat. I think a 5 is a fair rewatchability. I am the I'm a consummate student or studier, and I put it on my own volition earlier this week and turned it off. So for me, that really affected my score. It did used to be, if it was on TBS, in the evening, it would be put on and stay on, and now that's been replaced with The Office or whatever if it's on Comedy Central. But yeah, I'm a 5.
I'll go with a 6 for mine because this is not a film that I'm going to put on all the time, but if it's on, I'm going to leave it on much more so. I still have a lot of fun with this movie. I think there's a lot of moments that I get to enjoy out of it, and to me that makes it a lot more of an interest piece of seeing, oh, they have that. Maybe I'll turn on a couple of minutes of that, or if I see that it's on, just finishing out a bit of it.
For me, it's hard to say. This is a film that, in the days when we had our 18 different exchange students, this would be more on my list where I think they should watch it, because I think it helps to present a better understanding of America for foreigners than a lot of things do. Am I going to go out of my way? I think this film isn't more enjoyable if you watch it every 5 to 10 years. I went with a 6.
Well, the math will be very simple on this one. It is a 5.5. And then for audience score, we were given a 94 for Google users and a 95 for Rotten Tomato users, giving us a 9.45. So to repeat the categories, we had an 8.25 for Legacy, a 9.13 for Impact and Significance, a 6.75 for Novelty, a 6.75 for Classicness, a 5.5 for Rewatchability, and a 9.45 for Audience Score, giving us a final total of 45.83, and currently placing it on our list between Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, and Unforgiven for number 110. Somewhere in the universe, Kieran B's head is literally exploding that Forrest Gump finishes ahead of Unforgiven. I'm sure I will be hearing about this next week.
Yeah, I'm sure you will.
As always, if you have any disagreements with any of our scores, you can certainly write us at any of our socials at GMOT Podcast on Letterboxd, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and X. Or you can write us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com, or find us at our website, ronnieduncanstudios.com/GMOT Podcast. All right, remaining questions for this one. I think we kind of had generally addressed one before, but I'll start with, so in the movie, it quite literally lays out the rules that Lieutenant Dan loses a relative, and we see Gary Sinise die in every supposed American war, except one. He didn't have a relative in the Korean War?
It's the same generation as World War II.
Okay, but it said every American war. Does Korea not count as a war?
I don't know, but it would have been difficult.
Why not have, his uncle die in the war? Just said a relative.
Okay.
Maybe there was a distribution worry that they did not want to represent that one.
Maybe it was too recent. Yeah, maybe it was recent, or too recent, because I don't know, for whatever reason, if they're talking about Vietnam, they don't want to necessarily talk about Korea at the same time.
Excuse me. We're okay with talking about Vietnam, a much more polarizing war than Korea, but Korea is too recent.
I'm just throwing out an idea.
All right. There is a scene that bothers me in this movie. How the hell does Gump's boat crash behind him if it was going the other direction when he leapt off of it?
So I have two theories on this one. One, the wheel gets turned and it makes a curve, and then for dramatics it comes straight through the scene. Or two, they did what every social media reposter is doing right now, and they're just flipping the original video so it looks like original content. So maybe that was a weird edit where they had to flip it for dramatics or for something the way the scene was shot on the dock. But it does not make sense if you're in the world that Gump and Dan are on the dock.
Yeah, he jumps off the boat. It's going right. Then he's facing Lieutenant Dan with Dan being on his, I guess, right. And then the boat crashes behind him to his left. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
Continuity error. Anyway, if Jenny hadn't gotten sick, would she have ever told Forrest about Forrest Jr.?
No, I don't think so.
Yes.
See, however I answer this, it paints her differently, because if not, then her only reason is she wants somebody to take care of her kid. And that is a selfish reason and goes back to old ways.
Maybe not necessarily. My reason for saying no is that in her time where she went back to him and chose him, she wanted him to be just hers. After having experienced as much pain in her life as she had, she wanted something that was solidly hers, that was good.
Or she was waiting for him to finish his run, so she just happened to get sick during that 3 years and the 3.5 years that he was out running.
I do think it is the scene by how you actually view the movie. Because if you find her to be an endearing character, you would think that, yes, she would come to that path regardless. And it does seem genuine that she wasn't necessarily going to reveal that she was sick right away. She just wanted to introduce him to her son. But then why wait quite so long?
Another example of cell phones would ruin the entire plot of older movies. So she could have called him on his AirPods. He would have answered and said, "Oh, I'll be right back."
Well, only as far as he could run that far. So you have to hope he was near the Atlantic Ocean by that point. My last one. When does this movie take place? We kind of already generally talked about it. My guess is it's about 1985, 86. And Sarah, to address something you said earlier, it is not explicitly said that it was AIDS. I think it's heavily implied, and it leads the audience to believe that.
Not only is it heavily implied, they actually, in an interview later, came out and said it was AIDS.
Okay, because I could have also thought of, like, Hep A could have been reasonably put in here.
Yeah, which it's, that's one of the reasons that I looked into it a little bit, is because I was curious, and it seemed to be pointing in that direction. So it is something that I looked up, and they came out and said, yeah, it was AIDS.
And I believe, and I'm trying to think about it, but the cars that feather is moving across are definitely late 70s era. It was before any kind of Honda boom. But I'd probably have to go back, and I'm sure there's an answer in the vehicles in the background.
I guess more or less, and I'll repeat it again, that when I watched this originally, and mostly as like a kid or even in my high school years, I always assumed it was taking place contemporarily in 1994. But now that just you look over the timeline of the movie, there's no way you could get to 1994 based on all the years as it's adding up. So it has to take place sometime in the 80s.
Yeah, so my money would be early 80s, based on the size of the vehicles in that opening scene.
Okay. Any other remaining questions for you guys?
I have one, actually. What death more radically altered Forrest's life? Bubba or Jenny?
Just saying altered, I think the answer is Bubba's. Because Bubba set him on a path to go open the shrimp boat, start that life, and then he was in a place, and I'll use the word privilege intentionally here, he was in a place of privilege to be able to take care of Jenny and move forward. So that's my vote, at least on that question.
I would agree that you have to focus on the word altered in your question, because we only have evidence of one death really being able to alter anything. By the time Jenny dies in the film, we have another 5 minutes max left to go, and it's hard to really say how that altered him other than making him a single parent. But he didn't have to work, and he clearly loved his son. So how do you say that really alters him? Now, had the question been asked, which death is more impactful or is felt more by Forrest? I think it's already going to be Jenny. But you said altered, so I have to kind of by default go with Joe.
I'll agree with both of you on that point.
All right. Any other remaining questions? We do not have any listener questions this week. All right. So if not, then I want to say a quick thank you to both of our guests. Sarah, thank you for now coming back after 3 years. I'm not really sure what kept you on your hiatus other than just general life. You will be back at least 2 more times with us this year for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Knives Out. But any quick thing you'd like to say or plug again before we close out the show?
I've enjoyed my time back, and as for the 3-year hiatus, it wasn't supposed to be. I was supposed to be on last year. Somehow I never made it on the schedule.
Pretty sure I offered you the schedule and you never said another word.
I had set it up with Dad.
That's the problem.
Oh, yes, siblings.
Also, a thank you to Joe for being on with us for his first time. A quick shout out that you are welcome back anytime. And if you do get to 5 times on the show, you do get a complimentary hat.
Steve,
if that means anything.
That's the goal. Hats and then T-shirts. I know is tier 2 on the visitor scale. So
yes,
I got my sights on it. But this was fun. It's always good talking movies with anybody, and it's always good to have it last a little bit more than I can chat my coworkers' ears off. So. So I appreciate it.
Yes.
And as I understand it, your first overall podcast.
Absolutely,
ever.
Yeah. So I had a good time. I hope it comes through well, and hope anybody else hosting out there, feel free to have me on as a guest. I'm excited.
Good. And anything you want to plug quick before we go?
You can find me on Instagram. Get to it when I get to it. And then I suppose if there's any DFW people that need a realtor out there, Joe B. Realty at Instagram as well. So shot in the dark, but hey, you never know where you're going to get business, right?
Sure. I don't mind the hustle. So, again, our links or all the links for our guests will be available both in the podcast description for this episode as well as on our website. Final thoughts for the week, Dad. Let's make them pretty quick because we're running well over time.
I don't have a whole lot. I'm just trying to enjoy every day and enjoy spending the time doing films and being nostalgic, and enjoy the time that I spend with you.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Just a quick housekeeping note that hopefully this has made its way over to the video for YouTube, and hopefully I didn't have so many technical issues with this episode. Things falling down behind me, my lighting just being poor, the heat maybe giving me like sweat beads all over my forehead for this episode. It was a challenge to record this in a new studio, and we'll see you on the other side. But our episode from last week of Batman is currently available on our YouTube channel. That is youtube.com/@GMotePodcast if you want to find that. And also our Hangover episode from about 4 weeks ago is also available in full video format. So we are hopefully planning on doing more of these in a video format concept and hopefully bringing you a new angle of how to consume this podcast if you so choose. So we would appreciate any follows or subscriptions you might have on there. I know a lot of people are already subscribed in the audio version of this, and we appreciate you nonetheless. But if you want to take an opportunity, a little bit of a journey with us as we try out and test out this new video format, we'd appreciate that too. I will also say just very quickly, I did a double feature this last weekend of The Bike Riders and Inside Out 2. The Bike Riders, not necessarily a measure of its quality, but at least giving you a frame of reference, I liken to Goodfellas on motorcycles. So if you like Goodfellas and you like kind of cultural time period pieces about the rise and fall of a particular element of culture, this is the kind of movie for you. Your mileage may vary on whether it's as good quality-wise as Goodfellas is. I know that's held in high esteem and reverence. I felt Bike Riders got a little bit bland for my taste, but I still enjoyed it, and I think it is a very good actor's movie. Inside Out 2, I can already understand why it's probably going to be the juggernaut of the year, might finish as the #1 overall film for everybody. I think it's almost as good as anything in the original film, and so for a studio in Pixar that's been kind of circling the wagons for the last couple of years for some of the decisions not necessarily made by its studio, but by its parent company in Disney, and some of the other marketing that's been going on, I will say I enjoyed the film. There were a couple of things that I still have like some technical issues with, much like I did the first film, but I think it's endearing. I think it's a lot of cute little characters, and Inside Out could be to this current generation what Toy Story was to my generation in the 90s. So I'm glad to see something getting a big box office boost, and may it continue. So that will wrap things up for the week. Thank you very much to everybody out there for listening. Gentlemen, that's a very sad thing, to be nothing. Next week, for our 218th episode, we welcome back returning guest Kieran B. of the Best Picture Cast to the show, and new guest Sarah Shea of the Shea Cinema Podcast to revisit one of my personal favorite films of all time, 12 Angry Men from 1957, directed by Sidney Lumet, written by Reginald Rose, music by Kenyon Hopkins, starring Henry Fonda, Lee J. Cobb, Ed Begley, E.G. Marshall, and Jack Warden. You won't want to miss that one, so watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that more can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at thenewRonnieDuncanStudios.com or at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Find us on YouTube, Instagram, X, Letterboxd, or TikTok at the handle @GModePodcast. Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.